Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in AP English. We turn now in our Roberts text to page 777. This is Stepanchev's Seven Horizons, the 2006 offering. Now, Stepanchev is born in 1915 in Serbia. He does move to Chicago at age 7 and then takes degrees from the University of Chicago, and he writes his PhD from New York University. He taught at Queens College for 35 years and has been called often very Whitman-esque. He dies in 2017 at the age of, are you ready for this, 102. Well, just go ahead and take a look and realize that Seven Horizons was published in 2006, which makes him the age of 90 when this poem is written, which in and of itself makes this such an amazing text. So as we take a look at it, we're going to enjoy this notion of seven horizons. Now, let's pay attention to the number 7, of course, the number of perfection. And as we work through the poem, we're also going to pay attention to the cyclical nature of the historical reading here. And we're going to pay attention to the ways in which Yeats's Second Coming will come to mind. We've given already a lecture on Second Coming at learnstrong.net. Let's just read the poem and exegete as we go. Seven Horizons. It is an old story. The oppressed become oppressors. The conquerors are conquered. The grass rises from their bones, and the rat is totem. The archaeologist of mounds studies the seven horizons of death and discovers endless repetitions, civilization wearing out their plumes and dying under their tin cans, a shoe in the ashes, a set of false teeth, a shattered hand, a cistern full of heads of broken jocks and forgotten movie stars. Here in Flushing, I let the rain wash away my rotting selves, the rubble of what I was, the thick deeps of silence among the ruins, the 7 layers of abandonment no archaeologist will ever read. Now let's jump to 3A really quickly, because obviously the 7 Ages of Man from Shakespeare's classic, right, is part of what we're dealing with here. No question about that. We've given a lecture on that text at learnstrong.net. Notice that we will begin by talking about how old the story is, ironically, of course, by a poet of 90 when he writes this poem, right? Notice the story. He will say it. It's an old story. Now, we, of course, love to say in 303 that we are the stories we tell, the stories we retell, the stories that we accept, and, of course, we're also the stories that we learn and decide to reject. Notice here the idea of the story being an old story that's somehow repeated over and over again. We can't help but think of Auden's Musée du Beaux Arts about suffering never, never long, the old masters, right? And that notion that there's something to be taught from the study of the old. But notice it's also new. That is to say, the oppressed become oppressors. We can't help but think of our study of Marx and the Communist Manifesto, and of course the ways in which really what we're saying here is that it is the case that often that the subjugated become those who then are the oppressors, right? The conquerors are in fact conquered. Now here, of course, we're playing that game of circles, right? The horizons, the 7 horizons, the ages that will perpetuate. The grass rises from their bones, and the rat is totem. We can't help but think of hollow men. We are the hollow men, leaning together, headpiece filled with straw. Alas, our dry voices when we whisper together, quiet and meaningless as wind and dry grass, or rats feed over broken glass in their dry cellar. So we want to pay attention to the ways in which it's clear that Stepanchev is playing around with some of the ideas of T.S. Eliot and from the Hollow Men. And then he mentions the archaeologist, which is of course classic because we're going to come back to it in the last line. What does an archaeologist do? Well, of course, studies the past to try to understand the present and possibly predict things about the future. Notice it is the archaeologist of mounds, that is to say, of graves, mounds, of collections of humanity, right? And of course studies the 7 horizons of death. Notice horizon and death normally don't go together, so we have an interesting juxtaposition. Rediscovers, and then this will sound very much like Yeats in our study of Second Coming, endless repetition, civilizations wearing out their plumes and dying under their tin cans. Now this is what great poets do. They'll give us some kind of an image that makes you go, wait, tin cans? What are you talking about? Tin cans. And then notice with the colon all of the different kinds of things that represent this cyclical kind of history, right? A shoe in the ashes, a set of false teeth, a shattered hand, a cistern full of heads. Of course, these are really kind of grotesque images. But then notice of broken jocks and forgotten movie stars. So all of a sudden he'll fall into a very postmodern bit of lingo, right? That is to say, there are any number of ways to talk about the passage of these 7 horizons of death. One might be to just point out the ways in which our athletes are forgotten and our movie stars are as well forgotten. And then he'll reference where he lived in Queens, Flushing. He says, I let the rain wash away my rotting selves. We think about Thoreau's observation that he will say at the conclusion of Walden that he left for as good of a reason as he went to Walden. Perhaps he says, I had other lifetimes to live, other lives to live. And notice here, rotting cells, this kind of fleshing, this getting rid of some of the things that define us as who we are, and yet somehow we've transcended and included some of those old selves. It's compelling imagery, right? The rubble of what I was. What an interesting way to think about your life. The rubble of what I was. The thick deeps of silence among the ruins. And now we're back to it, the 7 layers of abandonment. No archaeologist will ever read. Notice how the poem begins by talking about the old story and ends up with this speaker speaking specifically about his or her, would we call it evolution? Would we call it enlightenment? Would we call it coming to this realization of the aging process? At 2a, obviously, one of the major messages here is that life is about cycles and circles and going and continuations. Of course, those opening lines of T.S. Eliot were speaking quite a bit. I think there's a lot of influence in this poem here of the idea that, in East Coker, he will say it for us, in my beginning is my end. In succession, houses rise and fall, crumble, are extended, removed, destroyed. And they're in their place as an open field, or a factory, or a bypass. Old stone to new building, old timbers to new fires, old fires to ashes, and ashes to the earth, which is already flesh, fur, and feces, bone of man and beast. I mean, those lines speak, obviously, very much to what is happening in this poem, no question. Notice in 2b the symbolism of 7 as the number of perfection, and yet here we're talking about perfectly rotting souls. Fascinating. We've mentioned a number of titles at 3a. Obviously, Yeats' Second Coming is a compelling way for us to think about how we read this poem. The idea that there is this sense that things repeat, things repeat. Santayana, the great philosopher, said it, those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. Of course, it's also true those who remember the past are still doomed to repeat it, it seems. This poem seems to suggest as much. Finally, at 3b, can you already recognize certain kinds of cycles of your life, of the lives of those that you live with, of your time and place, of your nation, of your world? Isn't it? It is kind of fascinating to recognize the ways in which we'll play the game over and over again. Well, I hope that our study here has led you to want to do more with Stepanchov's really remarkable poetry. Thank you.